Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host, my name's Larry Erickson, and for the next half hour or so, I'm going to be rattling away about some things that I think are worthy of your attention. As always, if you have any comments, questions, reactions, whatever, you can email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, whoviating at AOL.com, or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here somewhere during the course of the show. You can get the email address from there if you didn't write it down, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, just two things. Please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer, but you will get one. All right, I like to start off where I can with some good news, and this week I got some good news in the form of an update. Let's consider it some feel-good news to start the week off. Back in April of 2015, Dan Price, and I talked about this at the time, Dan Price is the founder and owner of a credit card processing company. It's called Gravity Systems. He shocked his employees by announcing that over the course of the next 3 years, he was going to raise the minimum pay at the company to $70,000 a year, an amount that was at least $22,000 over what was then the average pay at the company. He would pay for this, he said, by cutting his own yearly salary from $1 million down to $70,000 and using 75 to 80% of anticipated profits. Now, the right wing, of course, hated this idea. They called it nothing but a publicity stunt, labeled it pure, unadulterated socialism, which is kind of odd because it's still a privately owned company, but never mind. They predicted the 130 employees of Gravity Systems would soon be applying for welfare. It'll never work, they said. Instead, it'll wind up serving as an example of how socialism is doomed always to failure. So you might have guessed, the update here is, how's the company doing after a year plus? The answer is, pretty good. Business volume, since he made this announcement, business volume is up 30%, profits are up 85%, client retention is up. About the only thing that's down is employee turnover. In fact, things are so good that this summer, the employees pitched in together and they bought Dan Price a car. Not just any car, in fact, a Tesla battery-operated car, an electric car, the average sale price of which is, perhaps significantly, about $70,000. Now, the thing is, remember, this is still a business. It's still a business. It still aims to make a profit. But what Dan Price has shown, that consciously and deliberately being good to your employees, in fact, being very good to them, is not the losing proposition we're usually told, directly or by implication, that it must be, and that it is possible to run a successful, profit-making business without turning into an amoral greed hog or a smirking little prig. It's just that that's what usually happens. Dan Price's success is good news. All right, another bit of good news. This is actually pretty tepid good news, as news goes, for reasons which will be made clear. It's something that you may have heard about, but to really understand and why it's good and why it's really not so good, it requires a little background. One of the issues that has sort of percolated in the background of U.S. political debate over the last couple of years and even bubbled up a bit during the presidential primaries is that of mass incarceration in the United States. The fact that we imprison a greater portion of our population than any other nation. And by the way, I will note here once for all that this time I am not going to get into the racial or racist aspects of this issue. For now, I'm just going to be dealing with the numbers. One of those numbers is that with just 5% of the world's population, the United States holds 25% of its inmates. Between local, state, and federal jails and prisons, we have something over 2.3 million people in cages. Many of them for nonviolent offenses, and many of those in local jails have not been convicted of any crime at all. Rather, they are there for the crime of being guilty of being too poor to make bail. We imprison more men, we imprison more women, we imprison more children than any other nation on the planet. During the Get Tough on Crime days of the 1980s and 1990s, the rate of incarceration in the United States more than tripled. Between 1980 and 2010, the prison population went from 220 people per 100,000 population to 731 per 100,000 population, with the rate continuing to rise even as crime rates declined, as they have been doing since the early 1990s. Much of that increase in the prison population was driven by the so-called war on drugs, which Nixon aide John Ehrlichman admitted was actually a war on the anti-war left and the black community, but that, again, is a discussion for another time. That explosion in the prison population led to an explosion of something else: private, profit-oriented prisons. Prisons making contracts with state and federal agencies to build and staff prisons that they swore would cost less per prisoner because, of course, private profit is going to do things more efficiently than a government agency could, which was another idea that was running rampant in the 1980s. The result is that by the end of 2015, roughly 12% of the federal inmate population, about 22,000 prisoners, were held in private, profit-oriented prisons. These prisons were actually run by a total of just 3 different contractors, which together had received $649 million in federal contracts. Now, there have been questions about using these sorts of private prisons all along. Various prison reform and civil rights groups have called for an end to them, a position which actually got more attention when, during the primaries, Bernie Sanders made enough of a fuss about it, made enough noise about the idea of abolishing private prisons, that he ultimately embarrassed Hillary Clinton into first saying she would no longer accept campaign donations from lobbyists for these prison companies, and later that, quoting her, "we should end private prisons and private detention centers." The good news, we have actually now taken one small step in that direction. In a blistering report earlier this month, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice stated that the Bureau of Prisons has failed in its core mission to incarcerate individuals in facilities, quote, that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and secure. In its wake, State Department officials have concluded that, in the words of Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, quoting her, the private profit-making facilities, quote, simply do not provide the same level of correctional services, programs, and resources. They do not save substantially on costs, and they do not maintain the same level of safety and security as those run by the federal government itself. In fact, assaults by inmates on other inmates, by inmates on staff, and by staff on inmates were all significantly higher in the private prison system than in the government-run ones. So the Department of Justice has announced that department officials are either to decline to renew or to substantially reduce the scope of contracts for private prison operators when those contracts expire. The goal, according to Yates, is, quoting her, reducing and ultimately ending our use of privately operated prisons. Now, the problems with these sorts of private facilities were hardly a secret, and Yates says that government officials have been talking for months about discontinuing their use. But until now, the Department of Justice had failed to act. David Fathi, director of the ACLU National Prison Project, called the move a huge deal, both historic and groundbreaking, because it is a startling and major reversal, he said, of the trend over the last 35 years to more and more private prisons. It's a move, he said, we hope will be followed by others. But it is the reference to others that reveals why this is just tepid good news. Only a small portion of the people in prison in the United States are in the federal prison system, which in fact is the only one affected by this newly issued order. Most people are in state prisons, which are unaffected by the new policy. So privately run state prisons continue to operate with those states' blessings, often at the behest of and often to the benefit of lobbyists for the prison corporations. Even so, experts have said that the new DOJ directive is significant, and the hope is that once the dam of resistance to ending private prisons has been broken, that more such significant moves on other levels of the criminal justice system will follow. Now, it could be, and it has been noted, that this move actually does nothing about the issue of mass incarceration. It only changes who's running the prisons. But if we can do away with, or at least sharply limit, the notion of prisons as a profit center for private corporations looking to cut their costs in order to increase their profits, and if we can decide then as a people that if we want to confine people in cages as a means of punishment, that we should be prepared to bear the cost of doing that, and as a result start to make real cost-benefit analyses of imprisonment, we'll quickly realize that in the vast majority of cases, prison is not the best alternative, and we'll realize that our war on drugs, which has sparked much of the increase in the prison population, has been a total failure. And so it is to be hoped we would start making better decisions on matters of crime and punishment. And that possibility, surely, is good news. However, what is not good news is that the DOJ's directive has a truly giant loophole. The announcement does not apply to the Department for the Protection of the Fatherland because it and the DOJ are separate government departments. And it is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, or ICE, which I think is a remarkably appropriate acronym, and which is part of the Department for the Protection of the Fatherland. It is ICE which oversees the nation's network of immigrant detention centers, which means, of course, that these centers are beyond the reach of the Department of Justice. But it is those centers that, along with the war on drugs, are responsible for the dramatic growth in the private prison industry in the United States. Immigrant detention centers, or actually prisons, because, hey, if you can't leave, it's prison no matter what they call it. Detention centers that are holding immigrants, migrants, refugees, families, parents, children, babies, people who for the most part are guilty of no crime except maybe having crossed the border without all the proper paperwork, people too often held in deplorable conditions. In fact, the agency has 46 privately run, profit-seeking immigrant detention centers, accounting for more than 70% of all ICE beds. That was an increase from 62% just last year and from 49% in 2009. Imprisoning immigrants has become so central to the profits of the private prison industry that they have directly lobbied for harsher immigration penalties, including one of the more shocking requirements, which I bet you have never heard of: the Congressional Immigrant Detention Quota, under which ICE is required to hold an average of 34,000 people in detention on a daily basis. Need or cause apparently not being the determining factors, just numbers. Now, just as in the federal system, the problems with the conditions at these centers were no secret. They've been reported on numerous times, and they have led to repeated resistance and hunger strikes at these prisons. But not like in the federal system, the Department for the Protection of the Fatherland has made no move to change or improve things, despite having promised to do so. But then again, why should it? Because, the people involved, the people affected, they're just a bunch of foreigners. And there is once more a footnote to all of that. I mentioned that the United States imprisons more children than any other nation. It goes beyond that. The United States is the only nation in the world that will sentence children to life in prison without parole. As of 2012, there were over 2,500 people in prison sentenced to die in prison for crimes committed when they were children. In several states, that sentence was mandatory for certain crimes. But in that year, in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional, that sentencing rules had to take account of the fact that these people were children when they committed their crimes. As a result, some states dropped the practice entirely, but some others still allowed for it as an option, and still others said that the decision only applied to future cases, not ones already decided, so those already under such death in prison sentences were just out of luck. So there's still about 2,300 such cases when in January of this year, 2016, the Supreme Court ruled that that earlier decision was retroactive and so requires a new sentencing hearing for anyone serving a mandatory life without parole sentence for a crime that they committed before they turned 18. Which obviously is a good thing, but remember, this does not mean that life without parole sentences for children have been banned, only that they can't be mandatory. And so there are states that still have this as an option, which means the United States remains now the only nation in the world that has laws on its books that would lock up children for the rest of their lives. And we are taking a break. And here we are back again. All right, let's get to this quickly. There's no way I'm going to try to do an in-depth commentary on what's going on in this particular situation. That would take an entire book, and I expect in future years it will be the subject of several. But I did want to make a quick comment on news newly coming out of Syria. Which I expect you heard about, and which actually this news came just as I was preparing the show. On August 24th, Turkey sent tanks and troops into northern Syria. The purpose, or at least the claim purpose, which was surely a good part of the purpose, although not all of it, the claim purpose was to support a Syrian rebel force in pushing Daesh, that is ISIS, out of the town of Jarablus, which was the last stronghold ISIS had on the Syrian-Turkish border. The push was supported by the U.S. coalition, which means supported by the U.S., which conducted 8 airstrikes as part of the operation, which clearly signaled U.S. support for it, and therefore U.S. support for the Turkish incursion. Within hours, however, the so-called Free Syrian Army, one of the many Syrian rebel groups, and one backed by Turkey, had captured the town and driven Daesh out. But the question is, why did Turkey act now? Writing at Foreign Policy magazine, Faisal Itani of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council noted that Turkey's war on ISIS has been, quoting him, inconsistent, and suggested something more than striking a blow against ISIS was involved here. That something more is why I wanted to raise this now, even before the dust is all settled and cleared. A senior U.S. official told CNN that the U.S.'s assessment was that Turkey's cross-border action is not so much about stopping ISIS as it is about stopping the Kurds. The Kurdish Democratic Union Party, known as the PYD, which is backed by the United States, played a major role in driving ISIS out of the northern Syria town of Manbij in mid-August. From there, the YPG, which is the military arm of the Democratic Union Party, looked to move on to Jarablus, which is about 40 kilometers, about 25 miles north. And that, the U.S. official said, is what got Turkey interested. The Turks never cared about Jarablus until the Kurds wanted to get there, the official said. Now, here's the thing. Okay, the PYD and the Turks share a common enemy, in ISIS. But Turkey regards the PYD as a terrorist organization and says it is linked to Turkey's own Kurdish insurgents, the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, against which Turkey is now waging a scorched earth campaign in the southeastern part of Turkey. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said that Turkey will never accept a Kurdish-held area along its border. So, here we sum up. The U.S., Turkey, and the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, or the PYD, are all fighting ISIS in Syria. The U.S. supports the PYD, which some have called the single most effective force against ISIS in the conflict. But Turkey, which is also a U.S. ally, regards the PYD as a terrorist group linked to an internal group in Turkey, which Ankara also regards as terrorist. Looking at these sorts of conflicting alignments, Patrick Coburn, writing in The Independent, calls the Turkish incursion a gamble in a dangerous game. Turkey can act against ISIS, he wrote, but if this is a mask for an assault on Syrian Kurds, then it will be opposed by both the U.S. and Russia. That's because not only does the U.S. support the PYD, Russia has been appreciative of the Kurds' cooperation with the Russian air campaign in Syria. So an assault on Syrian Kurds could have unknowable effects on the region, including scrambling all of the alliances going on in Syria. And indeed, while Turkey was firing artillery at ISIS in Jarablus in preparation for the ground attack, it was also shelling Kurdish fighters north of Manbij in order to hinder or block their motion toward Jarablus. The Turkish foreign minister says his country wants the PYD to return to the east side of Syria's Euphrates River, which would mean not only forgetting about Jarablus, but also leaving Manbij. Otherwise, he said, we will do what is necessary. It is indeed a gamble, then, in a place where, as Coburn says, things are so complex that participants have difficulty telling who their friends are or even where their best interests lie. And that is always a dangerous place to be. All right, next up, one of our frequent features. This is the Clown Award, given, as always, for meritorious stupidity. And the winner of the Big Red Nose this week is former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer for an attempt at being clever that was so lame that it should be in one of those YouTube fail compilations. On August 16th, during an interview with Phoenix radio station KTAR, Brewer said that, and this is an exact quote, "People want a fighter. They're tired of the lying killer Hillary Clinton and Bill Clintons of the world." When she was called out about this, about the lying killer, she said, "I was trying to say Hillary Clinton. It was a stumble of the tongue. Good grief." Well, an audio clip of this proves that statement to be a lie. There's no slur, no alighting, no hesitation. The words are crisp and clear, and even the has only the slightest bit of hesitation to it. This was no stumble. This was intentional. This was planned. Now, you know, I don't think a whole lot of Hillary Clinton's dedication to total honesty, particularly when it comes to things affecting her political ambitions. And you know that I have noted that her record and her words mark her as more of a hawk, more of a militarist who will be quicker to go to war than Obama ever was. And his drone wars in multiple nations and boots on the ground that aren't boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria are bad enough. But she's not the issue here. Jan Brewer is. And the question is, just how stupid, just how lame do you have to be to think that saying lying killer Hillary Clinton is in any way clever? And how much stupider, how much lamer do you have to be to think anyone is going to believe this was a stumble of the tongue? Well, apparently, you have to be as stupid and lame as a typical right-winger, snickering over Brewer's bon mot because you know it was no stumble and you're hopelessly devoid of anything resembling a wit or a sense of humor that does not revolve around cruelty and sneering. That is, you would have to be like Jan Brewer, a clown. Now, next up, one of the terrors is going to be as quick as I can. One of the terrors of doing a weekly show is that something truly worth noting will come in just after your deadline. But by the time another week has passed, it seems too old to bother talking about. And it happened to me twice this week. One was about the Turkish incursion into Syria, the news of which I learned as I was preparing the show. And now, this time, literally as I was wrapping up the show and finalizing my notes, came the news that after 4 years of negotiations, Colombia and the rebel group called FARC, F-A-R-C, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, and I hope I didn't mangle that Spanish too badly, but it actually means the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, They have reached a final peace deal to end an internal war that has gone on for more than 50 years, that has killed more than 220,000 people and driven 5 million people from their homes. Now, the deal still has to be approved in a plebiscite scheduled for October 2nd, so it's not a done deal, but it's hard to imagine why anyone other than a bitter dead-ender would say no. This is one of the world's longest-running and bloodiest armed conflicts, and now it looks like it's ending, and I was going to be damned if I was going to lose the chance to have to say that. All right, last for this week. I've talked a number of times about this proposed massive 12-nation trade deal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP for short. There's a great deal to dislike about it. It would further empower and entrench transnational corporations. It has weak environmental and product safety rules. And like NAFTA before, it would probably cost the U.S. hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs and replace them with low-paying service jobs. And it's unpopular enough that Bernie Sanders was able to make it a centerpiece of his campaign to agree that ultimately forced Hillary Clinton to come out against it. So why do I bring this up again now? Because Barack Obama is all out for it, and he regards it as a major part of his legacy, to the point where he has now put Congress on notice that he intends to send legislation to enact the thing. Now, that action establishes a 30-day minimum before the bill can be presented, but in fact that's irrelevant because there's no way the White House is going to introduce this in the middle of a campaign where both major party presidential candidates and Jill Stein of the Green Party are all against it, and there are a few Democrats that will actually aggressively support it. What this means instead, that he has in this way telegraphed his intention to try to jam the pact through Congress during the lame duck session after the election, when political pressure from the public is at its lowest because it's the furthest from an election and because the public will be distracted by the sideshow of a transition to a new president. Now, Clinton, the likely winner in the fall, has declared she's against the TPP and she's against voting on it both before and after the election. And liberals and progressives are gearing up for a lame duck fight. So there's a good chance, at least a decent chance, that a move to pass TPP during that time will fail, especially since a good number of goppers in the House are pledged against it, if only to block something because Obama wants to pass it. Classic example of right thing, wrong reason. But that doesn't mean the fight will be over even then, because there are disturbing, troubling signs about Hillary Clinton's stand on TPP. There was a statement back in January from the chair of the Chamber of Commerce that once president she would flip to supporting it. More recently, there was a statement from Clinton bestie Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe saying the same thing. Her VP pick, Tom Kean, is a free trade zealot. And most recently, she picked former Interior Secretary Ken Salazar, a big fan of both the TPP and fracking, to be the chair of her presidential transition team. So gear up, folks. We are in this for the long haul, even giving Clinton every benefit of the doubt, even assuming her absolute sincerity in her words. The corporations and their allies, the ones with the inside track to access to the seats of power, they will never stop pushing. So neither can we. That's it for this week. We're going to get out of here. We'll see you now in 2 weeks. Remember, take the last week of the month off. So we will see you with a new show in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.